We use multiple choice questions and a little bit of humor to lighten the conversation up. Basically, we're trying to reach people who might otherwise not have these conversations, who might be intimidated or fearful or just put it off. We tried to make it more fun, especially within the EOL deck, because that is meant to be used with people who are approaching end of life.
What are some of your favorite questions in the card deck? Welcome to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. If you ever asked, how do I protect myself and those I love if something unexpected happened to me? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Niki Weiss, and together we'll explore how to protect yourself in a world where both your physical and digital legacy leave a lasting impact. And welcome back to another episode of Death and Dying in the Digital Age, a podcast where we talk about living in the life today and preparing for tomorrow. And today I have Lisa here. Lisa is the co-creator of what we call the Death Deck, believe it or not, how to gamify the conversation around death and dying. So Lisa, welcome.
Hi, Nikki. It's so good to be here. So I've worked in hospice almost 18 years now. I also have worked in emergency medicine close to 8 years. And so in both of those settings, I've seen time and time again that people aren't having these conversations and the stress and chaos that can come when we don't. We started the Death Deck years ago when I became the social worker for a family. Joe is the husband, Lori is the wife, and they had 2 young children. And basically there was a lot of chaos in the home around his death and dying experience because they just hadn't had conversations ahead of time. And so there were a lot of family members, his family of origin, as well as his wife and close friends, and everyone had ideas about what Joe would want. Unfortunately, everyone had ideas, but Joe couldn't tell us. And so years later, Lori and I connected and we started talking about this issue that I see all the time in my professional experience, and that left her feeling like, what can we do to help people not be in that same situation? So we decided to create the Death Deck in 2018. It launched, and we use multiple choice questions and a little bit of humor to lighten the conversation up. Basically, we're trying to reach people who might otherwise not have these conversations, who might be intimidated or fearful or just put it off. We tried to make it more fun, to make it a little more appealing so people could begin the conversations early.
And I think that having a conversation for most people, unless they've been through an experience earlier in life, it's just so unfamiliar. Like whether it's an unexpected death. Now you're in hospice, so an unexpected death versus the hospice experience, which basically, for those that don't know, hospice is a diagnosis of 6 months or less to live. Not that, I mean, I look at Jimmy Carter, who's still alive, well over a year after being on hospice. So hospice isn't necessarily a death sentence. It's just that you're making a choice to not continue with any sort of treatment. But it's also an opportunity, I find, as a gift. It could be a gift for some because they have that moment to have these important conversations.
Yes. I think, like I mentioned, I've worked in hospice a long time, so I absolutely believe in the value of hospice and the services provided. And it does come with a social worker and chaplain who are able to support the patient and family through the dying process and initiate some of these important conversations. Of course, some people are still reluctant, even when they have a prognosis. Some people are still reluctant to talk about it, and that's okay too. You know, there are some people that just can't get there, to be honest. But there are many more that, with a little bit of care, consideration, different tools that we can use, we can help people have these conversations. Because like you said, Niki, we aren't raised knowing how to talk about death and dying. It's often not modeled for us. And so it feels uncomfortable. And when something feels uncomfortable, we try to avoid it. So that's our purpose of the game, as well as just to give people some practice having these conversations, because it's especially hard when you don't have any practice talking about death and dying, and then you're faced with a medical crisis of yourself or a family member, and emotions are so high, and it's really hard then to begin the conversation at that point.
Well, it's interesting. You probably have experienced it too, being a clinician. How going into a family situation where mom might be in the hospital bed, in the hospice bed, and the family members are like, "Don't say hospice. Don't use the word." Like, we are given very specific instructions. I've heard stories of some professionals that have been literally kicked out of the home. Did you experience that at all?
Yes, that does come up sometimes. My rule of thumb is if the person has any sort of dementia diagnosis, I'm comfortable with not using the term hospice. If they don't have that diagnosis, then what I do is one of our end of life deck questions, which that's this one. This is for those approaching end of life. But one of our questions asks, how direct would you like medical professionals to be when explaining disease progression and the dying process? And so I will ask patients directly this question. Um, and if they tell me they want tell it like it is, all of it, then I'm going to be talking to the family about how this is their right. Ethically, this is their right to know what's going on with their body. Sometimes people really don't want to know. Um, one of the questions is be direct with family, but gentler with me. That's one of the answers. And sometimes people do choose that. They do prefer their family to know, and then they kind of trust the family to tell them as much as they think they would want to know. And that's kind of a different family style and family system. That's usually a family that makes decisions together and is a very cohesive kind of family system. Whereas a lot of people just prefer, hey, this is me, this is my body, this is my experience, and I want to know what's happening to me. Um, so that's how I approach that. But it does happen on a pretty regular basis that families ask not to tell them they're on hospice.
Well, I can see how the death deck, and again, you have the end of life, I have the death deck, how from a family conversation, how this tool, I mean, and it is a tool, can really bring the family together to have these meaningful conversations.
Mhm.
Perhaps the patient wants to have the conversation, but isn't strong enough physically, mentally, or emotionally to be able to support the family to get everybody to this difficult conversation. I've also seen and where you have one zealous family member who just wants to get in there and like, I'm probably that one. My family needs to like, because I want to get in, let's make the plans and decisions and the what ifs. And then you have, a brother of mine who just, doesn't, it barely wants to acknowledge or have that conversation, or even to start about pre-planning. So to be able to gently gamify
Mhm.
these difficult conversations, coming up with the idea and then coming up with the questions, what was that process like for you and your partner?
Um, it was really fun actually coming up with the,
And
the
actually, well,
question.
why I asked that question, because I thought like, I'm reading through the questions, and I'm like, I could be sitting around having a glass of wine, coming up with some of these questions. They are poignant, but at the same time, you can't be afraid. That's for sure.
Yeah, I would say, my just a little bit about that process because I have worked in this space. I think I was able to come up with quite a few topics and writing of the questions. And Lori she's a writer and she's a comedy writer, and so she really helped put the humor into the questions. And so it was a really nice combination of the two of us, her personal experience, my professional experience, a little bit of humor. My husband doesn't get credit, but he also helped add some humor too. He's a really funny guy. So Yeah. And I think, I've been really happy to see how much the humor helps. I think that, humor is a really effective way of reducing some of the fear and stigma around these conversations. And, um, watching people play the death deck, and hearing feedback from people that they are laughing and often crying as well, because stories are shared and these topics can be tender. But there's room for laughter too. And that's, I think, is a really important piece that we don't have to take everything so seriously. We can lighten up on this really dark topic.
Well, I always say, if you don't laugh, you're going to cry
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to, especially this end of life topic. And for many people, it's not necessarily the the death. It's more of the dying
Mm-hmm.
process or
Mm-hmm.
even the incapacitation, right? So for some of my patients, they were on hospice for 2+ years. Some of the um, maybe Alzheimer's or dementia, they're on very long term. The congestive heart failure, they tend to be on very long time. So it's not just a sudden, for some in the cancers, it's very quick, but for others, they might be on hospice choosing not to um, seek treatment anymore, but they're going to be around for a long time. And to wake up every morning to say, like, I'm still here, um, if you don't put some humor into it, how do you enjoy the day?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to be
Yeah.
able to, yeah, please.
Well, yes, I absolutely have found, in my work within hospice, that the people who fare the best with those long illnesses do have a sense of humor. They are able um, to find some humor and joy in small things in day-to-day life, laughing about the fact that you never thought you'd be using your urinal in bed. Men people There's a lot of laughter around
Lucky
the
won't, lucky
bathroom.
black womb.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots of room for humor. And I supervise social work interns sometimes. And when I have an intern, I'm always talking to them about two great tools that I think are really effective working with the dying. And one is humor. You have to use it. Um, you have to have some clinical judgment of when and where, but humor is really effective, as well as silence. I have found that when I stop talking and I just make a gentle observation and then stop talking and give it time, uh, because the first thing that people will say is just that top layer. And then if you just don't respond, if you just do a little nod along, like you're doing with me, Niki, then I'll keep talking. The person will keep talking, and they'll be able to share what's really underneath. Um, and so, yes, humor and silence, those are two effective tools that I have found incredibly helpful working in the end of life space.
And maybe kind of sharing some of those tools, right? So for someone who is sitting, and again, I'm it's not necessarily death, because the reason I'm saying is I've sat with patients who are going through infusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they'll spend hours just sitting in the chair, and what do you say?
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe as a social worker, can you talk a little bit about, sometimes people don't know what to say because
Mm-hmm.
they themselves are uncomfortable with the person that's either ill or going through the death or dying process, and how to make them, when to make that lighthearted conversation and when to listen, right? and
Mm-hmm.
and it's hard to make that discernment.
It is hard to know. I think being observant, like really paying attention to the cues that people give us, is needed in those situations. Um, you can kind of test the waters with a comment of sorts in one direction or the other, and watch the facial expression, watch the body, um, the body language and whether they're shifting towards or away from you. Do you feel like that just kind of stopped the conversation, or are they responding to your comment? I think also asking people directly, do you prefer distraction, or you want to talk about all this shit that's going on? That's that's what I'll say sometimes. Which do you prefer? Because sometimes it may just depend on the day what feels best for that person. Sometimes they just want distraction and want to just talk about, the newest episode of Real Housewives of New York or something. And other times people want you to just sit there and support them with your presence. So yeah, those are a couple ideas that I have for supporting people.
So then the question is, so when do we pull the cards out? Right? And what do we wait for, a funny moment, or do we wait for that dead silent moment of like, I don't know what else to say? Well, hey, how about this card? What do you believe in medium communication with the dead? And that's kind of a random, do you believe in afterlife? What are some of your favorite questions in the card deck?
Yeah, so I like the ones that you just picked out because I have found that asking people questions that are a little bit more removed from themselves first uh, kind of breaks the ice and helps get the conversation going, so that um, instead of asking, you're approaching the end of life, others are making your healthcare decisions, should price factor in? So that question I love. And I think it's an important one, but I don't start with that one. I usually start with the medium question, or if you'd live in a house that someone was murdered in, if it was your dream house, would you still buy it? Or, what movie death would you be most embarrassed to die by? Or, so that it's playful at the start. And then once we answer a couple questions that aren't directly about their end of life experience, then I move towards questions about, like the one I just said, with relating to the healthcare decisions and finances.
It's really interesting how people want to talk about other people's deaths,
Mm.
right? I say how if a good book, a good movie, right, a good story, if it doesn't have like sitting on the edge of, are they going to live or die, or even we're looking for that shoot 'em, kill 'em slasher movies, right? But when we slowly start looking inwardly at our own mortality, how that conversation, those walls come up very harshly.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty solid.
Mm-hmm.
And so, culturally speaking, do you find, I mean, you've worked with people from different backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
Could you say one cult, and I'm sorry, and you're also in the California, LA area, which is very culturally diverse. Can you speak about how let's talk about the cultures, different cultural experiences with your clients?
Yeah, I would say, well, I'll make a blanket statement that there isn't a culture that is doing this especially well. I think across the board that people are struggling to have these conversations, and some of the reasons may vary based on the culture. We have a Chinese population here in the South Bay of Los Angeles. And for some of those families, they believe that talking about it ahead of time may cause it to happen. And so that's one culture in which we have an extra sensitivity when we're talking with the patient and family. Um, but I would
Actually,
say,
I'm going to interrupt because I think that pervasive through many cultures. In the Jewish religion, we said, don't give yourself a kinahura is a very Yiddish expression. Um, and I think also in some of the African American cultures as well. It's like if you talk about it, then you're like hexing yourself that it's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's, I think some of these beliefs, we can work with them. It doesn't necessarily mean that there can be no conversations about the illness trajectory and supporting, asking people what they would want when they need more help. We can use we can talk about the dying process using the terms related to illness progression, right? So
Dancing around it.
dancing
How
around it a bit, but in a way
how many
that,
roads can you say death and dying without saying let them die?
yes,
Unless you
yes,
a card, right?
yes. Well, there is a lot in the end of life space that is super nuanced, right? There are families that I will directly say, when your mom dies, you call hospice. There are other families that I know to say, when your mom passes or when your mom stops breathing, call hospice, because of um, the tenderness and the protecting somewhat the feelings. I prefer to always say death and dying. I try as often as possible to use those phrases. However, I also respect that the patient and family experience, and I try to use the terms that they're using if it's um, if needed. If needed.
Lisa, it's been almost 2 decades that you've been working with this population. How have you seen the conversation change from 20 years ago to now within the digital age?
Yeah, well, the digital piece is an important one. I make a lot of bereavement calls to patient family members after their loved one dies. Lack of access to people's accounts is one of the number one frustrations that come up time and time again in making these calls, because oftentimes, especially with our older adults who have made arrangement, they've done a living trust, um, or will, but they've done it 30 years ago. And that's all they've done, right? So they keep telling their family everything is settled, everything is resolved, but all they've done is the asset part of their physical wealth and assets, and not all of the other things, including all of the digital accounts. And so I try as a hospice social worker to remind people of this while they are living, and check in on them on, okay, you do have an advance directive and you do have a living trust or some other documents designating your assets, but also, what about your passwords? What about your account numbers? Where is that information, so that grievers later are not dealing with the mess of trying to access funds and accounts and shut down Facebook account and all these things that you need passwords for.
And I would think the digital piece, right? Having those conversations about passwords. I think people just don't realize because it happens so quickly. I think maybe 5, 6 years ago, it wasn't an issue because we all use the same password 123. Maybe put an exclamation point. And now, if we don't have 12 to 15 characters in our password and different passwords for each login and using a password manager and where are those located, and now we've got more of our younger patients that might be more involved with digital assets such as cryptocurrency or even having an online business. Like it can get complicated very quickly, and I would think from a planning standpoint but also from a bereavement,
Mm-hmm.
how many like people that are still wish they had asked those questions beforehand. So is that round two on? So we're gonna create a new deck. Like, what's your digital password? What's your go work on that together. What's your digital legacy?
Yes, we do have a question in the EOL deck about passwords, because it is an important piece, and that is something that we tried to do, especially within the EOL deck, because that is meant to be used with people who are approaching end of life. We tried to provide some education on some topics like hospice and palliative care, but also give these prompts to help people think about things that maybe they haven't thought about before, because you don't think about, and when you're sick, everything is focused on symptom management, feeling okay. For the family, it's about meeting the needs of the family member, of the care recipient. They're taking care of their family member, and so having these conversations can be really hard. And that's why we created the EOL deck, was to make it easier for families, but also for the professionals, so that they can help these families to know what should be talked about, to then help in grief later.
Well, I know most of the end of life doulas that I know are carrying around one of your decks in their bag of goodies, right, in their tool bags, because it does provide this comprehensive conversation that, again, 20 years ago, we danced around. I think that um, there was less a willingness to step into it. What I find fascinating is the amount of content, digital content, where people are starting to document on video, on whichever platform, Instagram, TikTok, from diagnosis to death, like last breath death,
Mhm.
or and I'm starting to see where the loved ones are coming on a period of time after that person who documented their journey, their diagnosis to death journey. Then the loved one is coming onto the platform to make the announcement
Mhm.
that this person, who's been followed by thousands, some of them are hundreds of thousands of people, have then moved on, have transitioned, moved on, died, whatever people feel comfortable say.
Mhm.
So that to me is, for as a digital thanatologist, the fact that people are now starting to have those conversations, that we have hospice nurses that are now influencers
Mhm.
and funeral directors that are making quite funny of the funeral industry.
Yeah.
Allowing people to step into it more, and the death deck and the end of life deck, I think, is one of those tools that is giving people, empowering people, and that's really where I stand, right? Is Endeavo, my final playbook, is to empower people to have these conversations,
Mhm. Mhm.
not to be afraid, because part of living is dying.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, talking about all the influencers, and again, going back to the humor. There is humor in this topic. When we can make fun of something, when we think about like Saturday Night Live, which has been, a staple for what, 30 years now, longer. And we're that show every week is making fun of what are often hard topics, um, and as a country, or at least some of us, are laughing together about this difficult topic. And I think when we can laugh, or just have real conversations, we lessen the intensity and the fear, and it's not this, it's not this scary thing in the corner anymore. It's just a fact of life, like you said.
And to plan for it, right? I mean, we're all, whether we die unexpected or we get that terminal diagnosis or condition, or like I said, like my father-in-law, who's just sitting in God's waiting room at 94 years old, right? And we don't know how we're going to go. So at least to start planning for it, and to know that there are tools out there for our listeners. Lisa, do you have words of wisdom, lessons learned, anything you want to share with us?
Well, I would say that a couple things. One is that people do, in fact, want to talk about this topic. You might initially get a response of, "Oh, that's morbid. Why would we talk about that?" However, even with people who start with that framework, they have thoughts and opinions on this topic. We don't, as we mentioned before, we don't talk about death and dying that often. And so when we can give people an opportunity to do so, they usually have lots to say. And so I encourage people to be brave and, give it a go. And you don't have to, if a game element is not what you think would work best for your family member, there's lots of other ways to have this conversation through, media like TV shows and movies. My mom and I watched This Is Us, and so her and I had lots of conversations about Rebecca, who has dementia, her illness and progression, and what my mom would want in her situation. So we can use media like TV, movies, podcasts, articles to start the conversation. We can use the health status of other people that we know. Like, our neighbor just had a massive stroke and now they're on a ventilator, and this is what I would want in that situation. What do you think? We can use these things that occur in our lives if we look for them, and we can open the conversation through lots of different ways, and including our games.
And making it not so scary.
Mm-hmm.
I think they are important conversations. Talking to a bereavement counselor, I know you're more on the before, but I would think that from a bereavement counselor, to have the conversations before someone passes would enable them to move through the grief process, perhaps, I wouldn't say easier or faster, but it certainly would allow them less static, knowing that they had that conversation, knowing that they knew what their wishes were of their loved ones before they passed. And
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. And I think there's the two things. There's did things get taken care of before they died in terms of the paperwork and practical aspect, right? There's that it is very, very passwords. Yes. Which is very important, I think, for the grieving experience, because that just gives so many tasks to be doing that there's no room for grief when preparatory work is not done. But the other piece that is more emotional, and tender just keeps coming up for me today, so I'm going to go with that. But it's the second guessing that occurs in grief, where people wonder if they did the right thing for them. And that's what's so heartbreaking. The bank accounts, you'll finally get access. Those things are troublesome and all those things. But that emotional question of, did I do the right thing? That's something that's really hard to get an answer for in grief. And it is the most common question that people are always asking when I call them. And so if we can talk about it and have real conversations about how mom wants to be cared for, and you're able to execute those wishes to the best that you can, then that can reduce some of that second guessing and make the grieving experience like a little more softer.
Softer, and allowed to document some of those. So how many cards are in your deck? How many
The death
questions?
deck has 112 cards.
100, that's a lot of questions.
It's a lot of questions. You can play many times.
Right.
We usually
And
only get through about five
wow.
in an hour or two, because everyone has opinions.
And tolerance as well. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for your time and creating an awesome tool for those of us that really want to get into those dare to ask conversations, dare to ask questions. I believe all of the going through the deck. I love this last one. This one was my favorite. It's called Curtain Call. And it says, my perfect last day on earth should be spent doing what and with who?
Hmm.
And I think that peace of mind for those you leave behind is the greatest gift you can leave anybody.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, thank you so much. And we're looking forward to, so if anybody is interested, we do have the link within the podcast for you to make a purchase if you wanted to go ahead and buy your own deck of your end of life cards or deck. And with that, we'll say thank you, Lisa, for joining. And until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Legacy Podcast, where we talk about death and dying in the digital age. I hope this conversation inspired you to take control and plan for the inevitable to protect yourself and those you leave behind. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at digitallegacypodcast.com. Remember, life is full of surprises. What happens after you die shouldn't be. So keep your passwords safe and your playbook up to date.